Welcome back, everyone, as we dive into the third and final part of my breakdown of Matt Walsh's claims in his video about the real history of the American Civil War. I am back from Scotland. I recorded the first two episodes before I left, so it's been about a week and a half since I have been into this. So bear with me as we warm back into things. As always, the link is in the description to the original content, as well as a link to take you back to the beginning of episode 1. We have already done an hour and a half of reacting to Matt Walsh's original video, so now we're ready to take a look at the third part. I do want to thank SXRG for your support on Patreon. Let's get into this one. Oh boy, here we go.
The war was not exclusively about slavery.
Fair.
That is just a fact. It could not have been. Right up through the shelling of Fort Sumter, the North was profiting massively from the slave trade. 4 Union states had legal slavery. But if the war was not about slavery, then
now hold on a second, because just because those things are true, and they are, we've established that there were companies in the North and many, in fact, and industries in the North that were benefiting from the institution of slavery in the South. And yes, there were Union states that still had legal slavery. The fact is that, however, that what we're talking about, two things can be true at once, right? The North prosecuted the war initially to preserve the Union. There's no question about that. They were very clear about that. But the war happened because 11 southern states seceded from the Union. And we know that the Deep South, the Cotton States as they were called, most of them specified front and center in their secession documents, in their publications, in their speeches, that the institution of the enslavement of 4 million African Americans was the primary reason for secession. It was to protect that institution. They did not even try to pretend that it wasn't.
Well, the answer depends on who you ask. Though interestingly, Presidents Lincoln and Davis seemed to agree. Confederate President Jefferson Davis said, quote, "We are not fighting for slavery. We are fighting for independence. And that or extermination we will have."
But why do you want independence? That's the heart of the issue here. And this is why I think so often people talk past each other, is because people want to focus on the South was fighting for states' rights and they were fighting for independence. Well, they only wanted states' rights and independence specifically because they wanted to protect that particular issue, and they made no bones about that.
Lincoln himself told newspaper editor Horace Greeley, quote, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not to either save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that."
Absolutely true.
In other words, according to both presidents, the war was fundamentally about the question of keeping or ending the Union. The key argument against the idea that the Civil War was solely about slavery is that at the time of secession in late 1860 and early 1861, neither the incoming Republican administration nor mainstream Northern opinion advocated for the immediate abolition of slavery where it already existed in southern states. The Republican Party platform of 1860 opposed the extension of slavery to the territories, but didn't call for abolition of slavery in the South. But even if it had and stood a reasonable chance of happening, which it didn't, at least in the short run, most Southerners would not have been affected anyway. Only about 1/3 of Southerners were from households that had slaves.
Here's what I don't get about his argument now. He argued that the North benefited from the institution of slavery even if most Northerners didn't own slaves, but then won't apply that same logic to the South, where we say, okay, in some states, less than 10% of Southern families owned slaves, and that's true. In other states, it was much, much higher than that. And of course, if we're talking about that, people like to throw out numbers like less than 3% of Southerners own slaves. Well, yeah, that's true if you count every individual white Southerner as a person, but that counts every man, woman, and child. The proper way to look at that is what percentage of households in the South enslaved at least one person. But more than that, it's still true that even if you didn't directly enslave anyone, you still could benefit from the institution, right? Just as people in the North could.
The idea that 360,000 white men were going to line up and die for the sake of rescuing black people in the South is just absurd and ahistorical. In the words of the great Civil War historian Shelby Foote, quote, "No soldier on either side gave a damn about the slaves."
Not true. Not true. Again, this is where he's pointing to truth, but then twisting it a little bit. Yes, these men enlisted in 1861 and 62 to preserve the Union. But having just written a book about a company of soldiers from the Union Army, this statement is fundamentally false, because those guys were writing letters home after the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring it just and right and proclaiming themselves willing to die to free the slaves. So did they enlist to preserve the Union? Yes. Is it true that neither soldier on either side gave a damn about the slaves? Absolutely 100% false.
The soldiers' diaries support this. Haros von Bork, chief of staff to Confederate General Jeb Stuart, wrote a 558-page history of his experiences in the war. His memoirs contain no references to slavery at all.
Well, no, because in the aftermath of the American Civil War, the former Confederacy did everything it could to distance itself from the cause being fought over the institution of slavery. They focused completely on states' rights. It's the same thing with what you have after World War II, the argument of a clean Wehrmacht, that the average German soldier never did anything wrong. And the same thing was true for Confederate soldiers after the Civil War. They didn't want to be tied to slavery. They wanted it to be about something more noble than that.
Only one to a slave, in which he passed a large plantation which, I was told, belonged to a free Negro, one of the richest men of the county, who was himself the owner of numerous slaves.
So remember what I said at the very beginning of this series of videos that I'm doing, that what he was likely to do was to build an argument by proof texting, as we call it. Start with an argument and then cherry pick the right little pieces of evidence to make that case, right? How many plantations did they pass that were owned by white slave owners that had dozens, if not hundreds, of enslaved people on them? Probably many, but I don't think Matt Walsh is going to be pulling out quotes from Union soldiers talking about those. So I will. Okay, let me just read you a couple of brief accounts I pulled up real quick. And this is one of them from John P. Jones, writing in Tennessee in August of 1862. He said, "I am getting to be more and more of an abolitionist. I believe that this accursed institution," remember, this is before the Emancipation Proclamation, by the way, "this accursed institution must go down. We can never have a permanent peace as long as this curse stains our otherwise fair insignia. The ruler of nations can never prosper these United States until it blots slavery from existence." A colonel in the 53rd Indiana in 1862, again, before the Emancipation Proclamation takes effect in January of 63. He says, "I am no abolitionist, but the more I see of slavery in all its enormity, the more I am satisfied that it is a curse to our country. Outside the towns in the South, the people are a century behind the free states." And an unnamed Iowa soldier, which was quoted in Chandra Manning's What This Cruel War Was Over, he says, "By God, I'll fight till hell freezes over, and then I'll cut the ice and fight on," when talking about the cruelty that he witnessed in the South. And then we have another a sergeant in the 55th Ohio. "I am no abolitionist. In fact, I despise the word. But as long as slavery exists, there will be no permanent peace for America. Hence, I am in favor of killing slavery." I want to read one last one to you. I could tell you stories about guys from the 20th Ohio that I wrote about and their experiences in describing seeing enslaved people with chains and, with those things around their necks to keep them, and just being horrified at that. But this is a letter from Private Charles Flick in April of 1863, writing home to the local newspaper about emancipation and what it meant for the cause. And this is what he said. "As for myself, I enlisted to fight for the Union and for the best government ever sun shone upon, and for this I will stand up as long as there is breath in my body and the blood continues to flow through my veins. Some say they will not go to fight to free the Negro. I did not enlist for that either. But as it has come to this, let us go and wipe this awful curse of slavery out of existence, as it has been the cause of many a good man to shed his blood. And it was the cause of the first gun being fired on Fort Sumter. Therefore, let us go on and put down the rebellion, and if must needs be to do this, free every Negro held as property in the South. They understood what it was about.
The historian James McPherson went through the diaries of more than 1,000 soldiers from both sides for his book, For Cause and Comrades. He found that, quote, for Union and Confederate volunteers alike, abstract symbols or concepts such as country, flag, constitution, liberty, and legacy of the Revolution figured prominently in their explanations of why they enlisted.
Right. But as we know, the reasons why governments go to war and the reasons why individual soldiers enlist are not always the same thing. The Confederate government, those states seceded and they formed a government based on the desire to protect what they saw was a fundamental threat to their way of life, primarily the institution of slavery.
For Confederate soldiers, a more concrete, visceral, and perhaps more powerful motive also came into play: defense of home and hearth against an invading enemy.
Absolutely.
They signed up.
And there's no doubt that your average Confederate soldier saw it that way.
To fight out of duty, a concept that was a lot stronger 150 years ago than it is today. Many Union soldiers echoed Lincoln's calls for preserving the Union. McPherson found a Union soldier from Philadelphia who wrote that this contest is not the North against the South, it is government against anarchy, law against disorder.
Yeah.
Another from Michigan joined against the wishes of his family because he wanted to join, quote, all true patriots to sustain her government. Another from Michigan wrote that if the Union is split up, the government is destroyed, and we will be a ruined nation. Do not borrow any trouble about me. If I die in the battlefield, I do so with pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. And they saw this. Yeah, they saw the American government, the legacy of the Revolution, as being destroyed if a part of the country, dissatisfied with the results of an election, could just say we're out and just dissolve the government as they saw it. So they were absolutely thinking that way.
He did die in battle the next year. McPherson found immigrants lamenting that secession would make the country, quote, as bad as the deeply divided German states, and native-born Americans who said, quote, our fathers made this country, we, their children, are to save it.
All true.
McPherson notes that relatively few Union volunteers mentioned the slavery issue when they enlisted. The same is true for Southern soldiers. McPherson estimates that just 20% of Confederate soldiers even considered slavery a cause worth fighting for in the first place. Most were focused on repelling an invasion. Quote, defense of the homeland was one of the strongest of combat motivations. Even among soldiers from slaveholding families, only 1/3 explicitly voiced pro-slavery convictions. McPherson writes that many Virginians shared Robert E. Lee's view that they wouldn't fight unless it be in defense of Virginia. Another Virginian wrote, I would give all I have got just to be in the front rank of the 1st Brigade that marches against the invading foe who now pollute the sacred soil of my native state with their unholy tread.
All true. All absolutely true. But like I said, there's a difference between what a soldier's fighting for and what the government's fighting for.
When Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he did it as a wartime measure to suppress the rebellion. It's just as notable for what it did not do as what it did do. It did not free the slaves. No, slavery continued in areas under federal control, which included Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and parts of Virginia, Louisiana.
Listen, here's the deal. Abraham Lincoln, if he were a dictator, which many people try to claim that he was, he absolutely would have just, without a second thought, abolished slavery throughout the country. He knew he didn't have the legal authority to do that. Did Abraham Lincoln push the boundaries of what was legal in many situations, especially concerning putting down a rebellion? Absolutely. Does the Constitution give the government some more leeway with bending the rules during rebellion? It absolutely does. Suspending habeas corpus, for example, completely constitutional during a time of rebellion. So Lincoln is seeing an opportunity. Yes, it was absolutely a war measure meant to cripple the Southern economy, meant to help justify marching into southern communities and freeing their enslaved people, and turning around and using that same workforce that had been working southern plantations to help the Union war effort. And in many cases enlisting those guys to fight for the Union. But Lincoln also saw an opportunity to at least do something about the issue of slavery. And he saw a constitutional way to use the South's own viewpoint against them, which is the South viewed these people, these human beings, as property. And if the South viewed them as property, then they could legally be seized as property during times of war. And that's why they were often labeled as contraband. So, we could go on and on about that, but let's not argue that just because Lincoln told Horace Greeley, if I could preserve the Union by not freeing any of the slaves, I would do it, or that because the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free the enslaved people in states that remained in the Union, that somehow Lincoln didn't care about the slavery issue. That's not at all. Lincoln was just doing what he was legally able to do. And once the war started winding down, and he knew that there was the potential for these people to end up remaining or being returned to enslavement, that's when they pushed for the 13th Amendment to make sure that didn't happen.
Indiana, Tennessee. In practice, it only freed about 100,000 people out of a pool of millions. Lincoln did it because he wanted to prevent European powers from forming an alliance with the Confederacy, which seemed likely at the time and would have dramatically changed the South's fortunes. So the proclamation was a brilliant political maneuver that undercut the Confederacy's diplomatic efforts to court Europe because it made intervention politically untenable.
That's true, but again, we're cherry picking here, and we're hyper focusing on one little part to make an argument, right? That's true, but that doesn't mean it was the only reason. Just because Lincoln understood, and Lincoln was a brilliant politician, he understood the foreign policy ramifications of it, doesn't mean that was solely why he did it.
For European leaders who almost all opposed slavery. Now, wait a second here. We are not saying the war had nothing to do with slavery, because that would also be ridiculous.
Right.
It's just as much a cartoon caricature as what your idiot teachers taught you in school. No, slavery was a factor.
Listen, let's not label all teachers as idiots. I know some amazing teachers out there, and many of you are watching this channel because you first found a love of history from an amazing teacher. I had awesome social studies teachers in middle school and high school. Loved them, and they instilled in me a love of history. And I'm not going to label teachers. Are there idiot teachers? Yeah, there are some.
That led to war, and it was a major factor. South Carolina's Declaration of Causes for Secession references slavery 6 times. After seceding, South Carolina immediately made an appeal to other slaveholding states to
appeal to the people of the slaveholding states, not the anti-tariff states.
Secede, and in its appeal referenced slavery no less than 32 times. The South Carolina legislatures literally wrote, quote, "Slaveholding states cannot be safe in subjection to non-slaveholding states." When General Claiborne suggested freeing the slaves to fight for the Confederacy, his fellow officers were shocked and appalled.
Yep.
Slavery was a factor in the war, and probably a significant one.
It was the factor in the war. Were there other factors? Yes. There's a simple way to evaluate this. Is there any other issue? Take slavery out of the equation. Does secession happen without slavery? Absolutely not. 0.000% chance that any states secede in 1860 if slavery is not an issue. And the argument, of course, will be, well, if the Republicans were running in 1860 they weren't running on a platform of abolition, even though there were abolitionists in the Republican Party, then how could it have led to secession? Well, it's simple. For 80 years of American history, there had been this delicate balancing act between free states and slave states, making sure that neither one got so much power in Congress that they could upset the apple cart, so to speak. And so when new states came in, you have all these compromises, the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, et cetera, to make sure that that didn't happen. Well, when the Republicans announced that they were on a platform of no expansion of slavery into new territories, that meant no new slave states, which meant that as those territories, which by necessity would then be free states entered the Union, you're getting more and more members of Congress and senators who are from free states. And eventually there will be the votes to eliminate slavery. And so the Confederacy is seeing the writing on the wall. It's not happening in 1860, but it is going to happen.
But it was not the only factor. The South left for three other reasons, too. First, there was the balance of political power. In the Republic's
And what was the balance of power over? Slavery.
first 72 years, slaveholding Southerners occupied the White House approximately 2/3 of the time, or 49 years out of 72.
Okay, so if he's acknowledging the balance of power is directly tied to slavery, so why are we saying that's a separate issue? It is the same issue.
Some of the biggest figures in American politics were from the South, including Andrew Jackson, James K. Polk, and John C. Calhoun. To the extent that there were Northern presidents, many were sympathetic to the South, like Pennsylvania's James Buchanan. But demographics is destiny, as the northern states surged in population, driven by higher birth rates and massive waves of European immigration. The South's long-standing political dominance collapsed. The South's share of the House of Representatives dropped from roughly 48% at the founding to 38% by 1860.
And it wouldn't have been that high except for the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution, which said that 3/5 of the number of enslaved people in your state counted toward your representation in Congress. So it should have never been that high.
For decades, Congress maintained balance in the Senate by adding slave and free states at the same time. But after the country's massive territorial expansion, as a result of the Mexican-American War, that balance was doomed. There was no need for slave labor in places like Arizona or New Mexico, and so the South's relative power declined quickly. California was admitted as a free state in 1850. Free Oregon entered in 1859. Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860, coupled with the rapid rise of the Republican Party, which was a purely sectional northern organization at the time, signaled the end of Southern dominance in national politics. Second, the South had a financial motive. At the outbreak of the war, the American South produced roughly 3/4 of the world's cotton. From 1830 to 1860, cotton
produced by slaves. So again, he's giving these other reasons, but these other reasons are still directly tied to the institution of slavery.
Was by far the country's top export. It comprised literally half or more of all U.S. exports. 90% of exports to Great Britain came only from the South. And by the 1830s, more than 80% of the cotton grown in the South was being exported. At the time, the biggest source of revenue for the U.S. government was the tariff. This was great policy for northern states, since their tariffs protected their manufacturers from foreign competition. But it was terrible for the export-dependent South because retaliatory tariffs restricted their access to the foreign markets, and because their economy was built around agricultural exports, they had higher demand for foreign manufactured goods. So how much of a factor was money in the decision to secede? On Christmas Day, 1860, the South Carolina legislature issued an address to the other slaveholding states calling on them to leave the Union.
The address that mentioned slavery, by his count, what was it, 36 times?
Major grievances was, quote, "The taxes laid by the Congress of the United States have been laid with a view of subserving the interests of the North. The people of the South have been taxed by duties on imports, not for revenue, but for an object inconsistent with revenue, to promote, by prohibitions, Northern interests in the productions of their mines and manufactures."
So did you ever get into an argument with somebody, and in the course of trying to win your argument, you throw out every little thing they've ever done wrong, that they've ever done to you that you were grieved about, even though those things really had nothing to do with why you were currently in that argument? That's kind of what's happening here. The catalyst for secession was 1,000% slavery. But hey, since we're given our list of all the reasons that we are unhappy with how we've been treated by the North, let's go ahead and just tell you every little thing they've done wrong, right? So, yes, absolutely they're going to mention all their other grievances, but there was only one thing that led to secession.
The role that economics played in secession was obvious to outsiders. Karl Marx complained at the time that
Matt Walsh is going to quote Karl Marx now. All right, I'm ready.
London's biggest newspapers, including The Times, The Economist, The Examiner, The Saturday Review, were arguing that, quote, "The war between the North and South is a tariff war. The war is further not for any principle, does not touch the question of slavery and, in fact, turns on Northern lust for sovereignty.
So Karl Marx, from the outside looking in, is going to have a better idea of what the war was about than the Southern government themselves, in their own words.
A third reason was the massive cultural divide between the regions. The South was rural and agricultural.
Yeah.
The North was urban, industrial, and had huge numbers of European immigrants.
But that divide had always existed. That divide existed when Revolution happened. That divide existed when the Constitution came into being. Thomas Jefferson very much viewed the government as being one that should foster this idea of the agrarian society. It was always that way between North and South. It didn't lead to secession for the first 80 years.
Increasingly, they hated each other, something that became obvious on one cool Virginia morning in October 1859. Robert E. Lee was harvesting the rye crop in his fields in Arlington when a mounted soldier showed up and handed him a letter from the Secretary of War. The night
John
before,
Brown.
around 1:30 in the morning, the Federal Armory and Arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, had been taken by a group of armed men. A train passing through it sent telegrams on to Washington warning of 150 armed abolitionists who have come to free the slaves and intend to do it at all hazards, and to arm poor whites who are similarly aggrieved with the slave system. They were led by a radical abolitionist and insurrectionist named John Brown, who wanted to provoke a massive slave uprising across the South.
Yep.
It was Lee's job to take back Harper's Ferry with a company of 90 Marines, 2 howitzers, and a few local citizen militias from Maryland and Virginia.
It's interesting to me that they call on Robert E. Lee to do this, and there's a couple reasons why. I mean, because he's a cavalry officer. He had been, for the several years leading up to that. First, he had been been at West Point, in charge of cadets there, but then he serves under Albert Sidney Johnston in a cavalry unit out west. But now he's back home. He's real close to Washington. He's real close to Harper's Ferry. He's probably the top officer in the American Army that's available for this assignment, so it makes sense that they call on him to go lead some Marines for this mission.
He had such little time to prepare that he wore civilian clothing and a top hat, and he commandeered a Baltimore and Ohio engine car to get.
I will point out that at this point in 1859, Robert E. Lee didn't have the white hair and beard that you see there. He still had dark hair.
Get there, riding with just one other officer, the conductor and train's fireman. When Lee arrived, Brown's revolution had failed to materialize. The raiders were trapped in an engine house. The Marines waited until morning and then stormed the building. John Brown and 4 of his men were taken alive and later tried and executed.
Yep.
The South responded to the news with total horror. The Richmond Enquirer wrote, quote, "The Southern people have heretofore disregarded the ravings of Northern fanatics because they believe such madness to be merely a pecuniary speculation. But the attack at Harper's Ferry shows that the Northern people mean more than words."
So in other words, people are abolitionists not just because it financially benefits them, but because they actually believe in it. Well, okay.
Virginia's legislature awarded Lee a sword for his gallant conduct at Harper's Ferry. The North was euphoric. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote that John Brown was an idealist who put his ideas into action. Henry David Thoreau compared Brown's execution to the crucifixion of Christ.
I'm confused, though, because earlier in this video, maybe not today, but earlier in this entire video by Matt Walsh, he has been arguing that people in the North didn't care about slavery, that it was a non-factor to them. But now we're quoting how people in the North were euphoric over this and saw this as a righteous cause. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about the whole proof texting thing, right? You know, pulling out individual quotes and stories to make an argument. So earlier, when it was convenient to do so, we make the argument that people didn't care about it by pulling out some quotes. Now we're pulling out some quotes to show how different the North was than the South when it came to the slavery issue.
The abolitionist Wendell Phillips, also of Massachusetts, called Harper's Ferry the Lexington of today, comparing it to the opening shots of the Revolutionary War, and said Brown was the brave, frank, and sublime truster in God's right and absolute justice.
Yeah, there were absolutely people in the North who saw this as a turning point, who saw this as, like, you know, the step toward an eventual massive amount of bloodshed to end the slavery issue once and for all.
Northerners raised money to pay for Brown's legal defense. Many of Brown's conspirators were protected by Republican governors in northern states. The Northern response shook the South to its core. South Carolina's Declaration of Causes for Secession specifically mentioned northern states providing safe harbor for John Brown's accomplices. Other states complained of northern aggression and hostility. The attack on Harper's Ferry proved to them that the cultural bond it once shared with the North no longer existed.
And again, over what issue was that cultural bond being broken? Slavery. Oh boy, here we go.
For as long as political scientists and historians have been polled on the best presidents, Abraham Lincoln has topped the charts in every category. Modern presidents can't help but compare themselves to him.
But the life of a tall, gangly, self-made Springfield lawyer tells us that a different future is possible. That is why I'm in this race. Not just to hold an office, but to gather with you to transform a nation.
In school, kids are taught that Abraham Lincoln was the great emancipator, a champion of equality, a defender of democracy. To his contemporaries, he was the ape baboon of the prairie, a coarse, vulgar joker.
Now, again, listen, he's quoting history books say he's great, but the people at the time all said this. No, I could also read to you some incredible quotes from his contemporaries who praised him as just being one of the most remarkable people they had ever met. I'll let him finish with this little bit, and then I'll read to you some of those quotes.
A simple Susan and the craftiest and most dishonest politician that ever disgraced the White House. Now, in reality, he was none of these things. Although he may have been a coarse and vulgar joker, it's hard to know for sure. The greatest event in Lincoln's life, what turned him from man to myth, was his assassination. In the words of historian Michael Burlingame, quote, canonization began almost immediately within days.
Now, hold on. I think I can find you some quotes from his lifetime before he was assassinated to disagree with that. Okay, so these are quotes from before Lincoln's assassination. Frederick Douglass said that in Lincoln's company, he, quote, came to the conclusion that the hour and the man of our redemption had met in the person of Abraham Lincoln. And then, of course, after his death, he said he should never be spoken, his name should never be spoken, but with reverence, gratitude, and affection. Ralph Waldo Emerson, during Lincoln's lifetime, said he was a leader who was rapidly and amazingly gaining the confidence of the country. He praised his fair dealing, which is better than passion, and his ordinary degree of good sense. He characterized him as a man without malice or ambition or of typical politicians and possessing a native goodness. And here's a quote. I think this one's interesting in the larger picture. Gideon Welles, who was the Secretary of the Navy, wrote in his diary on September 22nd, 1862, of Lincoln. He said he remarked that he had made a vow, a covenant, that if God gave us the victory in the approaching battle, he would consider it an indication of divine will, and that it was his duty to move forward with the cause of emancipation. A writing about the strength of the president, James Russell Lowe in the North American Review, never did a president enter upon office with less means at his command outside his own strength of heart and steadiness of understanding for inspiring confidence in the people and so winning for it for himself than Mr. Lincoln. Harriet Beecher Stowe said he was a strong man, but his strength is of a peculiar kind. It is not aggressive so much as passive, and among passive things, it is like the strength not so much of a stone buttress as of a wire cable. And I'm looking at dozens of quotes like that, things that were written in publications during Lincoln's lifetime. Yes, it went to another level when he died, as all things do. People do turn into martyrs. They do turn into mythical figures when they die unexpectedly. And listen, my point in reading these individual quotes, some of you might be saying, well, you're doing exactly what you said not to do. I'm illustrating the point, which is that when you want to make a particular argument, you can always find some quotes to back it up. We shouldn't base our history on that.
Days of his death, his life was being compared to Jesus Christ. He was shot on Good Friday, and by Easter Sunday, a prominent American pastor said, "Heaven rejoices this Easter morning in the resurrection of our lost leader," referring not to Jesus, but to Abraham Lincoln. At the 1909 Lincoln Centennial, Illinois schoolchildren recited verses calling him a peasant prince, a masterpiece of God.
But you know what? The same kinds of mythology were happening around Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson in the South.
His oversized statue keeps watch over the National Mall in Washington, D.C. today. But in 1863, no one in America would have recognized the Lincoln we know today. Back then, it wasn't even clear if he was going to win re-election. He was, in the words of Michael Burlingame, the most activist president in history who transformed the presidency and the country. When he, quote,
he was also the only president that faced a rebellion from a third of the country. So yeah, there were certain things that had never happened before that happened in Lincoln's administration because a rebellion like that had never happened before.
Expanded the Army and Navy, spent $2 million without congressional appropriation, blockaded southern ports, closed post offices to treasonable correspondences, suspended the writ of habeas corpus in several locations, ordered the arrest and military detention of suspected traitors, and issued the Emancipation Proclamation on New Year's Day, 1863. To do all these things, Lincoln broke an assortment of laws and ignored one constitutional provision after another.
So let's just pull one of them out, the habeas corpus one, right? So yes, it is true that if you look at the Constitution, habeas corpus, the idea of knowing what you're being charged with, you know, instead of just rounding people up and throwing them in jail without charge, actually charging them with a specific crime and then working toward, putting them on trial. Suspending habeas corpus means just rounding, certain people up and throwing them in jail. So that is allowed for in the Constitution of the United States during times of rebellion. Now, of course, the argument is, well, if you look at where it appears in the Constitution, it does appear that that's meant to be something that is delegated to the Congress to do. Now, at the time Lincoln initially suspends habeas corpus in Maryland, for example, Congress is not in session. It's not like it is today where Congress is in D.C. pretty much year-round. They're only in D.C. part-time. They don't even come back to, after they're elected to come into session for months and months after the election. So Congress isn't in D.C. when the rebellion breaks out. And to get to D.C., they've got to come through Maryland, which is where the issue is, and troops are being attacked, and there's sedition happening. And so in that scenario, Lincoln suspends habeas corpus. Once Congress gets to Washington, they pass a law confirming Lincoln's power to do that. So, yeah, you can make those arguments, but these are extraordinary circumstances.
He was hated by Southerners, but also loathed by many Northerners. The abolitionist Wendell Phillips called Lincoln a huckster in politics, a first-rate, second-rate man.
This is in June of 1860, according to the image they just showed. A lot of people felt that way about Lincoln. Even people in his own cabinet thought that of him until they got to know him.
So Lincoln was, in a word, at the time, controversial. He was also a human, and a flawed one, like us all.
Yes.
He held contemporary views on race. He believed blacks were inferior to whites. In one of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he said, quote, "I will say then that I am not, nor ever have I been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not."
That's the viewpoint of most Northerners, even abolitionists. Many of them felt that way.
"Nor have I ever been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say, in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality."
And he's not wrong. I mean, it's not based on anything that's inherently inferior about blacks, but we see that to this day that there is still an issue and it's not based on the rightness of the argument that white people are better than black people. It's absolutely, we know that's not the case. There's no inferior and superior, but in the minds of people, we, in our selfishness and in our greed and in our conceit, we put ourselves above others, and that leads to that division. So Lincoln was right about the idea that it was going to be very, very difficult for the races to coexist. He was just wrong in how he wanted to remedy that, which was to ship the people back to Africa once they were freed. But listen, like many people, I hope, Lincoln's views on this stuff evolved. So how he felt in the 1850s during the Lincoln-Douglas debates changed dramatically by the 1860s as the Civil War is raging.
And inasmuch as they cannot live while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I am, as much as any other man, in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race.
He was not perfect.
I say upon this occasion, I do not perceive that because the white man is to have the superior position, the Negro should be denied everything. I do not understand that because I do not want a Negro woman for a slave, I must necessarily want her for a wife. The crowd laughed at that answer. It's really hard to know what Abraham Lincoln really thought because he was an incredible politician. Every word he said, every action he took, he did so knowing who his audience was and what their response would be.
Absolutely true. I say this all the time. I'm not sure we've ever had a more brilliant politician as president. Lincoln was really, really good at the game of politics.
And often overlooked. Historians in 100 years might look back at Barack Obama in 2008 and, based on his words, think he did oppose gay marriage because he said he did.
That's actually the very specific point I was going to make in comparison to the Lincoln stuff, is that if you look at Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, they were very vocal in opposing gay marriage, for example. That's just one particular issue, but now support it. That is what happens in life. We evolve as we get more information. As the world changes, our views on things can change as well.
But of course, he was pandering to an audience. He was a politician.
I don't know that he was pandering. Maybe, there's no reason for me to think that he didn't genuinely feel that way.
Lincoln and Obama might have more in common than just being tall, gangly, self-made lawyers from Illinois. But we do know that in the end, Lincoln did not free the slaves. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he still believed that, quote, the only long-term solution to slavery was voluntary colonization. On March 6, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln sent a special message to Congress urging the adoption of a joint resolution that would offer federal financial support to any state voluntarily adopting the gradual abolishment of slavery, with pecuniary aid provided to compensate owners for the inconvenience, public and private, caused by the change.
And that would have been a far cheaper way to deal with the issue of slavery than fighting a bloody 4-year civil war that killed 750,000 people. But the South was never going to go for that, especially not after the war had already started.
In total, Abraham Lincoln believed that slavery was a moral and political evil. He believed it should end gradually rather than immediately. And
he believed he wanted it ended immediately. He didn't believe that was possible legally or politically. Apart from the Civil War, that was the only avenue by which it could be eliminated, was with financial restitution to the people for losing their property, and over time. I think most people agreed that was the only way it was going to happen. You couldn't just radically transform the South overnight.
Supported the idea of colonization or sending freed black people to Africa or elsewhere as part of the solution. In other words, Abraham Lincoln had the exact same views on slavery as Robert E. Lee.
Big difference, though. Only one of them actually owned other people. And I didn't mention this sooner, but since we were praising Robert E. Lee's views on slavery, and I talked about it some already, and said, well, he didn't buy any of them directly. He inherited many of those people, right? You know who else inherited an enslaved man? Ulysses S. Grant. His wife was from Missouri. Her family were slave owners. Grant was desperately poor, and he was given an enslaved man by his father-in-law. Now, Grant could have turned around and sold that man and gotten out of all of his financial issues. At one point, he was selling firewood, and people thought that was just like the worst thing he could resort to, was to sell firewood. And he ran into somebody who asked him what he was doing selling firewood, and he said he was solving the problem of poverty. And he inherited what amounts to a Cadillac from his father-in-law. And rather than turn around and sell that man and keep him in bondage, but to save his own financial situation, he gave the man his freedom. And that is the difference between Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. The difference between Abraham Lincoln and Robert E. Lee. The difference is whatever views you have. Listen, don't tell me, if I tell you that I believe that that getting drunk is an egregious sin. And then you find me at the bar every night getting drunk. Doesn't matter a whole lot what I said, because it matters how I lived. It doesn't matter what Robert E. Lee said when he wasn't willing to immediately free those people.
After the war, Robert E. Lee received a presidential pardon and returned to Virginia, where he took up the presidency
So did just about every other Confederate.
Of what is now Washington and Lee University, a role many historians regard as the happiest period of his life, far removed from the burdens of command. At the moment of surrender at Appomattox, Lee could have urged his devoted soldiers to scatter into the Appalachians, waging a guerrilla war that might have dragged on for decades, sapping northern resources and claiming countless more lives.
So are we going to praise him that after 3 years of leading armies in the field, from the summer of 62 till the spring of 65, after he led those armies in the field and thousands and thousands and thousands of soldiers died on each side, we're not going to praise him because he didn't encourage his men to continue a guerrilla war?
Instead, true to his character,
I don't know about that.
He chose the path of honor and, remarkably, reconciliation with the Union. He urged his men to lay down arms, return home, and rebuild as loyal citizens. Today, efforts to erase Lee from history often stem from sheer historical illiteracy, but a deeper motive lurks: resentment towards a man who embodies virtues increasingly rare in modern America. They hate him not for his flaws, but because he represents unattainable ideals, tactical genius, a man of unyielding duty, honor and dignity, a Southerner whose leadership at Chancellorsville still echoes in military academies worldwide.
Yeah, but you know what? There are a lot of other examples of that among Americans who didn't fight in a rebellion against the government. I'm just saying.
They know they'll never measure up. No statues will rise for fleeting figures like Mark Milley or anyone else, but Lee's legacy endures, outlasting the vandals who would topple his monuments or even disturb his faithful horse Traveler's grave. In the end, Robert E. Lee is a reflection of the Civil War itself, far more nuanced and multifaceted than the simplistic tales spun in high school classrooms or viral videos.
That I will agree 1,000% with, and that's true of all of history. The Civil War is absolutely much more nuanced than we can typically teach, or that we typically do teach in a classroom.
A full reckoning with the real history, such as Shelby Foote's epic 1.2 million word trilogy spanning 3,000 pages, demands depths that no textbook or hour-long internet video can capture. The mainstream narrative is a cartoon. The war was never a straightforward crusade against Southern evil. Secession was not categorically treason. Abraham Lincoln was not a messianic figure. The story most Americans...
He was, though. I mean, you can argue he shouldn't have been, but he definitely became a messianic figure. There's no doubt of that.
...have heard is a fairy tale. But one thing is true. Wars have consequences, and victors shape the story.
I think the American Civil War is a great example of how history is not always written by the victors. I mean, I think for a lot of people, even to this day, people's views of the American Civil War have been shaped by the Southern lost cause narrative after the war, a war in which they lost. I mean, the number of people that I encounter on this platform, but also in general in life, who just absolutely refuse to believe that slavery had anything to do with the American Civil War is just baffling.
That is the enduring lesson of the Civil War.
All right, we have wrapped that up. Obviously, there's so much more we could talk about, and I've done other videos reacting to other commentators whose views were maybe not quite as nuanced as Matt Walsh's were, and I know some of you are saying those weren't nuanced at all. Check out my reaction to Razor Fist, for example, and I'll put the link to that up in just a couple of minutes here as I wrap this up. And I know many of you have labeled me as woke and a liberal throughout the comments. There are thousands of comments on these videos, so I haven't read all of them, but I've seen a sample of them. And hey, you're all entitled to your opinions. I get that. But I hope that you've learned some things along the way between what Matt Walsh has said and what I've said. I hope that this has enhanced your knowledge. And if you think I've earned it, please consider subscribing to the channel, hitting the like button. Check out some of my other content. We don't always do things this controversial. We dive into a lot of different kinds of topics in history, so I hope you'll check those things out. I want to thank Rob H. and Josh for your support on Patreon. Check out some of these other videos. Thanks for watching.